It was a cold evening in September 1954. The clouds over the Pacific Ocean were so thick that the boundary between the sea and the sky had completely vanished. Captain Arthur Penhaligon was banking his Lockheed P-38 Lightning toward the base. Arthur was no novice. He had spent thousands of hours in the air, but that night was different. Suddenly, the needles on his dashboard began to spin frantically. The radio was filled with nothing but noise, but then one final message reached the base. Arthur's voice was trembling. He said only this: "The sky is bleeding. Don't look for me. The door is closing." After that, there was only silence. Arthur's plane vanished from the radar, and for 7 decades, not a single piece of his aircraft was ever found. Time passed. Arthur became a missing legend. But 70 years later, on a morning in 2024, a deep-sea research team was surveying an uncharted trench off the coast of Australia. Their sonar hit something that shouldn't have been there. At the bottom of the ocean, 4,000 feet down, sat a plane. When they sent their remote-operated vehicle, ROV, down, the sight that greeted the camera lens shocked the entire team. It was Arthur's plane, but the strange part was that the plane hadn't crashed. It sat on the seabed as if someone had placed it there with extreme care. There wasn't a single scratch on its fuselage. When the team zoomed into the cockpit, they found the detail that turned this discovery into the world's greatest mystery. Inside the cockpit, there was no skeleton of Arthur. Instead, there was an old leather flight bag and a glass jar containing a strange blue liquid that seemed to pulse with light. But the most terrifying thing was a fresh message etched into the metal of the plane's body. This message hadn't been written in 1954. It looked brand new, as if someone had scratched it into the metal just yesterday. "I am still flying. Do not open the jar." How was this possible? How could a plane that disappeared 70 years ago be found perfectly intact at the bottom of the ocean? And who wrote that message if Arthur wasn't there? When the team attempted to retrieve the flight recorder, black box, they realized the temperature inside the plane wasn't freezing. It was warm, as if the engine had just been turned off. Arthur's final message, "The sky is bleeding," now began to take on a hauntingly different meaning. Scientists and historians from around the world descended on the news. But when the team opened the leather bag, they found Arthur's diary. The final page wasn't dated 1954. It bore the date, May 2024. The handwriting was unmistakably Arthur's, but his words were chilling. He had written, "Time is not a straight line here. I have seen what man was never meant to see. I have seen the sun break into 2 pieces." Captain Arthur Penhaligon hadn't just disappeared. He had been chosen. But for what purpose? And what was that blue liquid that was still pulsing in the jar after 70 years? As the team attempted to lift the plane to the surface, the color of the sky began to change. Thousands of people on the Australian coast witnessed stars appearing in the middle of the day. Arthur's plane wasn't just wreckage. It was a gateway that had finally been opened. The research vessel the Odyssey was silent as the ROV's mechanical arm gripped the glass jar found inside Arthur's cockpit. Back in the control room, the monitors displayed the blue liquid in high definition. It didn't behave like water or oil. It moved with a rhythmic, organic flow, almost like a heartbeat. Every time the liquid pulsed, the electronic equipment on the ship flickered. The deep-sea scientists were baffled. At 4,000 feet below, the pressure should have crushed a glass jar instantly. Yet this fragile vessel remained intact, defying the weight of the entire ocean. As the ROV began its slow ascent to the surface, the lead researcher, Dr. Elena Vance, kept her eyes on the diary found in the flight bag. She turned back to the page dated May 2024. The ink was fresh, smelling faintly of ozone. Arthur's notes described a second sky, a place where the stars were always visible, even when the sun was up. He wrote about flying through a rift that appeared like a crimson wound in the atmosphere, the bleeding sky he had mentioned in his final 1954 radio transmission. According to the diary, Arthur hadn't been under the water for 70 years. To him, only a few hours had passed, but those hours were spent in a dimension where time moved at a glacial pace compared to our world. He claimed that the blue liquid wasn't a chemical, it was condensed time. He had been instructed to bring it back to a specific coordinate to prevent the closing of the door. But who had instructed him? The diary spoke of the Watchers of the Rift, entities that existed between the ticks of a clock. Suddenly, the ship's alarm blared. The ROV was still 1,000 feet from the surface, but the water around it began to boil, not from heat, but from a massive surge of kinetic energy. On the surface, the Australian coast was experiencing a weather phenomenon that defied all meteorological records. A massive, circular cloud formation appeared directly above the Odyssey, turning the afternoon sky into a deep, bruised purple. The stars Arthur had written about began to shimmer through the clouds, bright and cold. "Bring the ROV up now," Dr. Vance shouted, but the winch had jammed. The blue liquid in the jar began to glow with such intensity that the ROV's cameras were blinded by white light. On the deck of the ship, the crew felt their watches stop. Digital clocks reset to 0. The very air felt thick, as if they were walking through honey. They were entering the time dilation field Arthur had described. A low, vibrating hum began to echo from the depths of the ocean. It was a sound that didn't travel through the ears, but through the bones. It was the same frequency recorded in Arthur's black box, the sound of the door opening. Just then, the ROV's cable snapped, but the ROV didn't sink. It remained suspended in the water, defying gravity, as the glowing jar within it began to pull the ocean's water upward into a massive, swirling spire. The spire of water rose hundreds of feet into the air, connecting the surface of the sea to the center of the purple cloud formation. In the middle of this water column, the glowing jar floated upward, carried by an invisible force. The crew watched in terror as a silhouette began to form within the spire. It was the shape of a man in a 1950s flight suit, his hand reaching out toward the jar. "Arthur," Elena whispered, her voice caught in her throat. The figure wasn't a ghost. It was solid, vibrating with the same blue energy as the liquid. But as the figure touched the jar, a massive crack of thunder shook the world. The midnight sun, a second, smaller sun, erupted into existence inside the eye of the storm. The final radio message from 1954 finally made sense. The bleeding sky wasn't a metaphor for a sunset. It was a warning of a celestial collision. The world seemed to split open. As the figure in the 1950s flight suit, the shimmering image of Captain Arthur Penhaligon, touched the glass jar, the spire of water collapsed into a million crystalline shards. But the jar didn't fall. It hovered in the center of the purple vortex, its blue liquid now spinning so fast it looked like a solid core of sapphire light. Above the Odyssey, the midnight sun pulsed with a terrifying rhythm. It wasn't a star made of gas and fire. It was a hole in the sky, a perfect circle of white-hot radiation that cast shadows in directions they shouldn't exist. Dr. Elena Vance grabbed the ship's railing as the deck tilted. The magnetic pull from the rift was so strong that metal tools were flying off the tables, sticking to the hull of the ship. She looked at her hands. The skin seemed translucent, flickering like an old film reel. "We aren't just in a storm," she realized, her voice trembling. "We are being rewritten." According to Arthur's diary, the midnight sun was a phenomenon called a temporal sink. The Watchers used these breaches to harvest energy from stable timelines. In 1954, Arthur hadn't crashed. He had been pulled through to act as an anchor. He had spent 70 years in the void between seconds, a place where he could see every moment of human history happening at once. But he had seen a flaw. He had seen that the Watchers weren't just observers, they were scavengers. The blue liquid, the condensed time, was the only thing that could stabilize the rift. If the jar broke before the rift was sealed, the year 2026 would be overwritten by 1954, or worse, by a future that hadn't happened yet. The two eras were colliding in a massive, invisible wave. Suddenly, the silhouette of Arthur Penhaligon turned toward the ship. His eyes weren't human anymore. They were glowing pits of Mila blue light, mirroring the liquid in the jar. He wasn't just a pilot. He had become a conduit. He pointed toward the horizon, and Elena followed his gaze. There, emerging from the bruised purple clouds, were the Watchers. They didn't look like aliens from a movie. They were massive, geometric shadows that distorted the light around them. They looked like towering monoliths made of smoke and static, thousands of feet tall, standing on the surface of the ocean. They weren't moving, but the sea beneath them was evaporating instantly. They were feeding on the time leak. Arthur's message. Elena screamed to the crew. The radio message from 70 years ago wasn't just a goodbye. It was a frequency. She ran to the communications room. The black box from the P-38 Lightning was on the table, still emitting that low, vibrating hum. She realized that the static Arthur had broadcasted in 1954 was actually a sequence, a code meant to resonate with the blue liquid. If they could play that 1954 recording through the ship's high-power sonar, they might be able to trigger the jar to explode outward, sealing the rift from the inside. But there was a catch. The diary's last page, written in May 2024, had a final warning. The one who plays the sound becomes the lock. To save the world, someone must step into the bleed. The Watchers began to move. One of the massive geometric shadows reached out a limb toward the floating jar. The air screamed as the rift began to expand, threatening to swallow the Odyssey and everything within 100 miles. Elena held the 1954 tape in her hand. She looked at the figure of Arthur, still suspended in the air. He wasn't waiting for a rescue. He was waiting for a partner. The bleeding sky was now turning a deep, obsidian black. The stars were no longer cold. They were burning. Elena realized that if she pushed the button, she wouldn't just be saving the world. She would be stepping into a 70-year-old mystery that she might never return from. The air inside the Odyssey's communication room was thick with the scent of burnt ozone and salt water. Outside, the geometric Watchers had formed a circle around the floating jar, their static forms vibrating with a sound that felt like sandpaper rubbing against the soul. Dr. Elena Vance held the 1954 frequency tape, the final radio message of Arthur Penhaligon, over the sonar console. Her hands were shaking. She knew that the moment she hit transmit, the frequency would collide with the condensed time liquid, creating a temporal feedback loop that would either seal the rift or tear the fabric of the current year into shreds. "Doctor, don't do it," her lead engineer screamed over the roar of the atmospheric vacuum. "If you broadcast that signal, the ship's electrical system will be vaporized. We'll be stranded in a dead ocean." But Elena looked out the reinforced window at the figure of Arthur. He was no longer just a silhouette. He was becoming more solid by the second, his 1950s flight jacket appearing detailed and worn. He looked directly at her, and for a fleeting second, his glowing blue eyes softened. He was tired. He had been holding the door shut with his own will for 7 decades, and he was losing his grip. In Arthur's diary, he had written, The signal is the anchor. The pilot is the chain. But every chain eventually breaks. Elena realized that Arthur wasn't just a pilot anymore. He had become a living battery for the Watchers. They were using his connection to the year 1954 to drain the life out of 2024. She slammed her hand onto the transmit button. The ship groaned as the massive sonar arrays beneath the hull roared to life. The 1954 radio static, Arthur's trembling voice saying, "The sky is bleeding," was amplified 1,000,000 times and shot into the deep water. The sound hit the floating jar with the force of a physical hammer. The blue liquid inside didn't just pulse. It exploded into a blinding supernova of sapphire light. The emerald black sky turned white. The geometric shadows of the Watchers shrieked, a digital, mechanical scream that shattered the glass windows of the ship. The midnight sun above them began to invert, turning from a white-hot hole into a black sphere of pure gravity. Everything was being pulled toward the center: the water, the air, and the very light itself. Elena felt her feet leave the floor. The ship was being lifted out of the water. In the chaos, she saw the jar shatter. The condensed time didn't spill. It expanded into a massive, translucent clock face that covered the entire horizon. The hands of the clock were spinning backward at a dizzying speed. Through the blinding light, Arthur reached out across the void. His hand wasn't glowing anymore. It was human. As his fingers touched the edge of the Odyssey's deck, the static frequency of the 1954 message reached its peak. The door Elena had been told to seal began to glow with a golden hue, reflecting a world that looked like a peaceful morning in the 1950s. "You have to come with me," Elena shouted, grabbing Arthur's hand. But as their fingers locked, she felt a surge of memories that weren't hers. The smell of 1950s aviation fuel, the sound of a jazz radio station, and the sight of a woman waiting on a tarmac 70 years ago. Arthur shook his head. "The message, it wasn't for the base," he whispered, his voice finally clear and audible without the radio. "It was for you. You are the one who finds what is lost." With a final surge of energy, the black sphere of the midnight sun collapsed in on itself. A massive shockwave of blue energy rippled outward, flattening the ocean for miles. When the light finally faded and the Odyssey slammed back into the water, the sky was blue, the sun was hot, and the Watchers were gone. The crew stumbled onto the deck, gasping for air. The ocean was silent. There was no rift, no purple clouds, and no geometric shadows. But as Elena looked down at her hand, she realized she was still holding something. It wasn't the tape, and it wasn't the diary. It was a 1954 military dog tag, warm to the touch, with the name Arthur Penhaligon etched into the metal. But when she looked at the sea where the plane had been discovered, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The plane was gone, but in its place, a massive, ancient stone pillar had risen from the trench, covered in carvings that looked like the blueprints of the Odyssey itself. The ocean surface was eerily calm, but beneath the Odyssey, the sonar was screaming. The stone pillar that had replaced Arthur's plane wasn't just a rock. It was a massive, black obsidian structure pulsating with a rhythmic vibration. As the ROV descended one last time to inspect it, the team huddled around the monitors. What they saw defied every archaeological record on Earth. The pillar was etched with laser precision carvings, but they weren't ancient hieroglyphs. They were modern schematics. "That's the engine design for this ship," the head engineer whispered, pointing to a section of the stone. "And there, that's the chemical formula for the blue liquid we found. But these carvings are thousands of years old." Dr. Elena Vance stared at the dog tag in her hand. The realization was starting to settle like a heavy weight. Arthur hadn't been a victim of a random storm in 1954. He had been a messenger sent by a version of humanity that had already mastered time. The Watchers weren't just scavengers. They were the guardians of a failed timeline, trying to prevent Arthur from delivering the condensed time to 2024. She opened the flight bag one last time, searching for anything she might have missed. Hidden in a false bottom was a small, metallic disc. When she touched it, a holographic projection filled the room. It wasn't Arthur. It was a woman who looked exactly like Elena, wearing a uniform from a century into the future. "If you are seeing this," the projection began, her voice steady but hollow, "the loop has been closed. Arthur was the first of us to go back. He carried the seed of the blue liquid to ensure that by the year 2026, the technology to stabilize the rift would exist. Without his sacrifice, the midnight sun would have consumed the Earth in 1954. The projection explained that the Watchers were actually the remnants of a future where the rift wasn't sealed. They were hollowed-out versions of humans who had lost their time anchor and were now forced to wander the void, feeding on the past to survive. Arthur's final radio message, "The sky is bleeding," wasn't just a warning for the base. It was a timestamp. It was a signal to the future that the delivery had been made. But Arthur stayed, Elena said to the empty room. He didn't come back to the 50s, and he isn't here in 2024. She looked back at the sonar image of the pillar. At the very base of the structure, the ROV's lights caught a small, sealed compartment. Inside was a single, preserved photograph. The ROV's mechanical arm retrieved it and brought it to the surface. When Elena held the physical photo, she nearly collapsed. It was a photo of Arthur Penhaligon, looking older but happy, sitting on a porch with a woman who looked exactly like Elena. On the back, in fading ink, was a note. "We didn't go back to 1954, and we didn't stay in 2024. We found the third sky. The jar was the key to a place where time doesn't run out. Don't look for us in the ocean, Elena. Look for us in the stars." Suddenly, the ship's radar picked up a new signal. It wasn't coming from the sea or the sky. It was coming from the pillar itself. The obsidian structure began to glow with a soft, golden light, the same hue as the door Elena had seen earlier. The vibrations were changing, turning into a melody, a sequence of tones that matched the static of the 1954 radio broadcast. The pillar wasn't just a monument, it was a transmitter, and it had just begun to send a message to the rest of the world. The obsidian pillar's golden glow didn't just illuminate the ocean. It reached into the very atmosphere, creating a shimmering curtain of light that could be seen from space. As the Odyssey bobbed in the center of this radiance, the melody coming from the stone began to synchronize with every radio, television, and smartphone on the planet. It wasn't an alarm. It was a download. The third sky wasn't a physical place in our galaxy. It was a higher state of existence, a dimension where time was no longer a cage but a canvas. Arthur and the future Elena had used the condensed time from the jar to build a sanctuary for humanity, a place where the Watchers could never reach. The pillar was the bridge, and the signal was the invitation. Dr. Elena Vance stood on the deck, watching as the stars above began to shift. They weren't moving. They were revealing their true forms. The night sky was filled with thousands of glowing geometric shapes, the lifeboats sent from the future sanctuary to guide the world through the coming rift. The 1954 radio message, once a cry of terror, was now transformed. The static cleared completely, and Arthur's voice boomed across the global network, clear and timeless. "The sky is no longer bleeding. The door is wide open. Do not be afraid of the silence, for that is where the music begins." At the base of the pillar, the ROV captured a final image before its batteries finally failed. The obsidian surface had changed. The schematics were gone, replaced by a list of names, millions of them. These were the names of every person who had ever been lost to history. The vanished pilots, the missing sailors, the civilizations that disappeared without a trace. They hadn't died, they had been recruited. They were the architects of the third sky, waiting for the year 2026 to bring the rest of us home. As the golden light reached its peak, the pillar began to dissolve into pure energy. The Odyssey found itself floating in a sea of liquid gold. Elena looked at the dog tag in her hand one last time. It started to glow, then evaporated into a tiny spark of blue light that flew upward, joining the thousands of other sparks in the sky. The video ends with a slow, panoramic view of the Earth. From the dark side of the planet, we see millions of tiny golden threads rising from the oceans and the forests, connecting the world to the third sky. The mystery of Captain Arthur Penhaligon was never about a plane crash or a missing man. It was a 70-year-long rescue mission. The screen fades to black as the final 1954 radio recording plays. But this time, it's not the sound of static. It's the sound of Arthur's engine, humming perfectly as he finally touches down on a runway made of light. A final message appears on the screen. History is not what happened. History is what we are becoming.